Welcome back, students. This is video number 2 on Modular 7, Poverty, Income Assistance, and Homelessness. So we're going to proceed into a discussion about welfare reform. So as we have discussed, current social values have a significant impact on the attitudes towards and the delivery of economic assistance to the poor. Decisions about who should receive assistance, the type and the amount of assistance to be provided, and the ways assistance is provided are all affected by the prevailing social values of the time. The prevailing social values are what legislators and policymakers use when developing the structures and systems to deliver income assistance. So when we're talking about efforts to try to address issues of poverty in the country, there are so many different ways of viewing it, so many different ways of thinking about how to resolve it, and so much of it has to do with the value system of the country who has voted in, legislators, either at the state level or the federal level, voted in governors and presidents, and overall, those are the folks that are determining what and how these programs are going to be administered. So how they view poverty, how they view solutions to poverty, will pretty much dictate the way that programs will be implemented and operated. So, continuing on the discussion of welfare reform and particularly relevant legislation, really the first place we ever saw any policy effort at trying to address poverty was with the Social Security Act of 1935. This act has been modified many times over the years to create new programs, to modify existing programs, or to do away with programs. So as an example, when the Social Security Act of 1935 was initially implemented, one of the components of it was the Aid to Dependent Children's Program, and it was later retitled Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or what was referred to as AFDC. AFDC, a broader version of the Mother's Pension Program established early for war widows, was intended to support children of single and most often widowed mothers. So in 1996, under President Clinton's administration, we saw the development, implementation, and passage of what came to be known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Budget Reconciliation Act. Signed into law by President Clinton in 1996, it was intended to, and this is a quote from President Clinton himself, end welfare as we knew it. It converted the AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, to what became known as the TANF program, or Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And this became a block grant program, which is an important consideration, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. It was considered to be the most significant social welfare legislation since the Social Security Act, and it resulted in deep cuts to basic programs for low-income children, families, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, as well as fundamental structural changes to the AFDC program. So block grant program. A block grant program is a program that's often initiated or implemented by the federal government, in which there are broad responsibilities that are dictated to the states along with funding, but the ultimate implementation of those broad directives is left individually up to each state to determine how best to achieve those objectives. So there's usually a substantial amount of funding, money, that becomes available to each state, these broad guidelines as to what the federal government is expecting the state to achieve given these funds, but ultimately it's up to the states to determine how best to implement those programs and meet those objectives. So the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Budget Reconciliation Act, again, allowed states to deny aid to any poor family or category of poor families. So just as I explained with these block grants, every state was allowed to set their own criteria for who was going to be eligible for benefits and who would not be eligible for benefits. It prohibited states from using funding to provide aid to families that had received assistance for at least 5 years, unless there was a serious hardship exemption, and then up to 20% of recipients could receive benefits past 5 years. But by and large, it was expected that each state was supposed to provide assistance over a period of time that was not to exceed 5 years to individuals and families. And it's important to recognize that that was not a continuous 5 years necessarily. So if a person no longer found that they needed assistance, say maybe after 2 years, but then something occurred, maybe they lost their job or something like that, and now they needed to go back into receiving TANF, or temporary assistance for needy families, then the clock would start sort of again when they came back into the program. So it wasn't over a 5-year period, it was cumulatively, it was over 5 years. Included an almost 20% reduction in SNAP program expenditures. So this is what SNAP is, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, typically what a lot of people refer to as food stamps. So there was a serious cut in SNAP program expenditures, which had an impact on the working poor, the elderly, and people with disabilities. And denying a wide range of benefits to immigrants, including poor immigrant children and poor immigrants who are very old and who have incurred disabilities after entering the United States and were no longer able to work. So there was just a whole host of different populations that were impacted by this legislation and by the effort to try to reduce the federal government's expenditures in terms of addressing poverty in the United States. While some individuals' families did benefit from welfare reform, others were terminated when they exceeded the 5-year lifetime limit on benefits. Research has shown that some families in poverty have barriers to accessing employment, preventing them from meeting the state's program's expectations. So barriers can include issues such as mental and physical impairment, substance use, low literacy or skill levels, learning disabilities, having a child with a disability, problems with housing, childcare, or transportation. When participants were forced to discontinue the program and benefits ended, there was no safety net or set of programs created that would give them a pathway back to employment. So it's important to recognize, and I think probably many of you are familiar with it, is the fact that probably the biggest piece of this welfare reform effort was the whole implementation of welfare to work. And that was the fact that individuals, in order to be able to receive benefits, needed to be in some kind of work training program. They needed to be moving towards training or the opportunities for employment that would move them out of the TANF program. And I think that you could easily see how some of these barriers that we've listed here definitely could impact an individual's ability to be able to continue in some kind of an education or training program. So again, this work first, emphasis on clients taking any job, regardless of wages and benefits initiatives throughout the country have resulted in many clients becoming employed. So there are folks who went through these kinds of training programs and were able to discontinue their dependence on a program like TANF. Most of these clients have been able to find jobs that pay minimum wage, well below the living wage needed to achieve self-sufficiency. And I will say that in California, minimum wage now is different in every state. And in California, I believe it's around $15 an hour. And I think that went into effect in January of this year, possibly. And so those numbers don't reflect our current situation, but it's also questionable whether these are sufficient enough resources for what might be classified as a living wage. Many of the jobs that people were trained for and eventually found themselves in did not include things like employee benefits, particularly benefits related to healthcare. So there was still a need for things like Medi-Cal. And these jobs also are less likely to have flexible work arrangements. So it may impact their ability to be able to care for their children, find time off for when their kids are sick or when they need health checkups or for things like parent-teacher conferences. So there was a real need, and there continues to be a real need, that these are the kinds of jobs that also can support the childcare needs of these particular participants. So as a result of these changes to AFDC, so converting AFDC into TANF, the federal government did see that welfare rolls declined. So the number of people enrolled in any kind of a welfare program did reduce. But the question really is, did it lift people out of poverty? Did these programs lift people out of poverty? So the White House touted declining welfare rolls as proof that welfare reform works. Unfortunately, most people who exited welfare were employed in low-paying, dead-end jobs with few or no benefits. There has been some revisions in recent years. Some of the initial provisions of the federal welfare reform laws have been relaxed. Things like SNAP benefits were reestablished for the elderly, people with disabilities, and children of legal immigrants. So, trying to, forgive me, guys. Okay. Whoop. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to do 2 more slides on this video, and then we'll take a break. But I wanted to address what are the current strategies when you think about trying to address poverty at a global level? What are the current strategies for addressing poverty? And again, I say global. We want to look at it from a very holistic level, very broad. So the first line of defense against poverty is the existence of a strong economy and strong employment systems that are structured to provide full employment at wages sufficient to bring workers and their families out of poverty. So, I mean, in other words, what we're saying is if we have a strong economy and a good jobs market, and those jobs are paying a living wage, and housing is affordable, and groceries are affordable, then the likelihood of us having a large percentage of our population living in poverty gets reduced, right? There will probably always be some small percentage of our population that may still be struggling, and trying to find a way to emerge out of poverty. But by and large, if you're the economy and having a robust economy, progressive economy, all of those are contributing factors to helping to raise people out of poverty. Unfortunately, today, it can be increasingly difficult for families to earn enough to pay for housing, food, and other necessities needed to maintain a minimum standard of living. Even though regulations require workplaces to pay a minimum wage, this amount in many geographic areas falls far short of the amount needed to make a living wage. And a living wage is defined as 3 times the amount of money needed in each location to rent an apartment of a given size. So a living wage for a family of 1 is very different than a living wage of a family of 4. And a living wage in Denver, Colorado is very different than maybe a living wage in Fresno, California. So it has a lot to do with the place that you live and the size of your family. So again, what you're looking at in terms of a living wage would be 3 times the amount of money needed, say in Fresno, to rent an apartment of a given size. So say you need an apartment for a family of 4. So that's the way that you would calculate a living wage. In addition, affordable housing has become increasingly difficult to obtain in the United States, and the costs for things like childcare, healthcare, and other necessities have become a luxury for some families. The second line of defense against poverty are social insurance programs. So you guys all understand what an insurance program is, because you probably own an auto insurance policy, right? So think about how an auto insurance policy works. Every month, once a year, on some kind of regular basis, you give this auto insurance company money. And you drive your car year 1, year 2, year 3. Oh my gosh, in year 4, there's an accident. Your car's got some damage. You take it to the insurance company. And because you've been paying into this plan over all of these years, you are now provided with assistance, quote, funds in order to fix your car. So when you think about that idea of an insurance program, it's important to recognize that many of you have been paying for years into a social insurance program. So these are almost always going to be deductions that are coming out of your paycheck. And the most extensive social insurance program in the United States is OASDI, Old Age and Survivors Disability Insurance, which we commonly refer to as Social Security. We've talked about Social Security when we talked about the New Deal and all of those kinds of things, but just to review, Social Security provides retirement income to supplement private pensions and savings of the elderly and persons with disabilities and their survivors. Another type of social insurance is unemployment compensation insurance. So you may not recognize it, but you pay every month, every 2 weeks, whenever you get paid, you're having a portion of your payroll check taken out to cover unemployment compensation insurance, which is the way that if your job was to end or the company was to close, this becomes the pot of money that you can then go to for unemployment insurance. Another one is workers' compensation. Another type of social insurance program provides medical assistance and cash benefits to employees who are injured on the job and those who develop job-related illnesses. So I think, the really strong message that I want everybody to get here and for us all to understand is these types of programs, Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation insurance, all these programs are insurance programs. You've bought these programs. You've paid into these programs. So this is not what we would typically think of as as welfare. These are programs that you've invested in, and when the time comes and you need those funds, they should be coming back to you. Finally, the third line of defense against poverty. So the first line of defense has been, a strong economy where everybody is able to get jobs and be able to pay all their bills. The second line of defense is all these social insurance programs that you've been paying into, so that if you become injured, you've got money. If you retire, you've got money. If you become disabled, you've got money. Now, the third line of defense against poverty is a system of public assistance programs to those families who have fallen into poverty and to those who have limited or no income from wages. So these may be people, again, who have no savings, who have not paid sufficiently enough into Social Security to be able to start withdrawing from it, or don't meet the qualifications for it. So this is what we purely think of as public assistance programs. These are families and individuals who do not have enough money to maintain an adequate standard of living, and they are helped by cash assistance programs based on need, such as temporary assistance for needy families, general assistance relief, and supplemental security income. Excuse me. The benefit amount from these programs is not enough to bring a person above the poverty line, only up to a standard that's established for the specific benefit program. Okay, so we're going to pause here. And when we come back, we're going to dig deep a little bit more into these public assistance programs.